Farid is a embarrassment to his great father, who was one of the important nationalist scholars in India. It's an embarrassment for him to say pivot from the Middle East. Brother, there was no pivot. They were thrown out. Thomas Piketty is a liberal. Lots of liberal people are also worried about social inequality. In fact, even sections of the IMF and the World Bank and so on are worried about social inequality.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us Vijay Prashad. Vijay, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
I wanted to start with Palestine. The latest numbers are 19,000 people are dead. Palestinians are dead, and UN Relief and Work Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East has said that 1.9 million people are already displaced, which is about 85% of people in Gaza. And this was 4 days ago, so the latest numbers may be even more. Um, Israeli Defense Minister Gallant has said to Jack Sullivan, U.S. National Security Advisor, that this bombing campaign will go well into 2024. I wanted to ask you, like, beyond the numbers, you have been there, you have written extensively right after the 2024 Operation Protective Edge. Beyond these horrific numbers, what does this episode mean for people in Gaza?
Well, it means the end of Gaza as far as the general appearance of what's going on, makes you think. The Israelis have been bombing in a sustained way uh, down the length of Gaza, starting in the north, first at around Gaza City, Jabalia refugee camp, the major hospital network, and telling Palestinians to keep moving south into a safe zone. They made the argument that you can go down Salahuddin Street to Khan Yunis, you're okay. Then they started pursuing people into Khan Yunis. It was always really deceitful for the Israelis to say that from Khan Yunis south is a safe zone. Because, when Hamas was born in 1987, Khan Yunis was one of the key cities of their support base. It was very clear that the Israelis were not going to allow the bombing to end north of Khan Yunis. Then they went down and they plowed all the way almost to the Egyptian border, which is why 85% of Palestinians have been displaced. And the bombing has been, vicious. Like entire streets have been razed to the ground. Bulldozers are there. The Israelis are already talking about rebuilding settlements inside Gaza, reclaiming their settlements, and so on. Look, over 320 families have lost more than 10 family members. Entire families are being wiped out. This means the way they are doing this, the way they are conducting it, that they are not trying to occupy Gaza. In fact, that's not what the Israelis are doing. That's a limited objective. What the Israelis are doing is trying to erase the Palestinians from Gaza. That's a much more intense and deeply troubling war aim. To occupy Gaza is one thing. You go in, you dismantle the whatever Palestinian security services there are, whether Hamas or other factions, and Israeli soldiers patrol, very much like the West Bank, which is occupied by the Israeli army. After 2006, the Israelis garrisoned Gaza. They didn't occupy it directly. It was an occupied territory, but garrisoned from outside. That's a low bar, in fact, occupation of Gaza. They want to erase the Palestinians. It's much more harsh, vicious, the loss of life catastrophic. I have friends in Gaza who don't want to leave because they keep saying, if we leave, they'll never allow us to come back. When their ancestors left 1948 Israel, there was a UN Security Council resolution, 194. UN Resolution 194 gives the Palestinians the right to return. Israel has never honored UN Resolution 194. So people, my friends, who are under pain of death in Gaza, getting bombed almost daily nearby, the dust, the toxic chemicals in the air, and so on. And they say, we don't want to leave because they'll never allow us to come back. And in fact, that is what it seems to be as their objective: vicious attempt to erase the Palestinians from Gaza.
It looks like people in Gaza who were originally displaced from various parts of Palestine, and some of them were reduced to Gaza, which became much more vicious after 2006 blockade, are now pushed more into the Sinai Desert. Like this is almost like a second phase of displacement, if you like. Um, I wanted to come to the role of the US in this conflict. The New York Times on November 3rd carried this horrendous opinion piece in my opinion. I mean, this is not by Bret Stephens or Thomas Friedman. This was like New York Times editorial, which wrote in defense of what was called as the humanitarian pause, basically saying that Israel has a right to eradicate Hamas, but there should be some limited, intervention in terms of humanitarian aid. How do you see and this seems to be increasingly, this seems to be the line that Washington is towing. Biden recently saying that I have not asked them to stop going after Hamas, but just be a little more careful. How do you see the role of Washington in this conflict?
Well, I wouldn't accept the views coming out of Washington, D.C. On as for their surface meaning. So when Biden says we would like them to bomb slightly less viciously, I'm going to come back to that. I wouldn't accept that. The first thing to say is that 60%, actually more than 60% of the US public is calling for a ceasefire. And only 4% of the US Congress is calling for a ceasefire. You can see the great divergence of democracy here. The vast majority want this conflict to end. They want United States to stop arming Israel, to back Israel diplomatically. United States Deputy Ambassador Robert Wood was the lonely hand in the UN Security Council vetoing a ceasefire resolution and so on. Only 4% of the US Congress is for a ceasefire. That's an interesting divergence. It's puzzling that people believe and accept this attitude of, yes, they must eradicate Hamas, but they shouldn't be so vicious. Let's go back to how the United States fights wars. Let's take Iraq, which I know very well. It's an interesting fact that when the 2003 illegal war began against Iraq, illegal again, because that's what the UN called it. There was no UN mandate for that war. When it began, the United States started with a military campaign whose theory is called shock and awe. They bombed all infrastructure around Iraq, destroying the airport, destroying power plants, destroying water, purification plants. It was a ruthless bombardment of civilian infrastructure and also bombing civilian neighborhoods. As that war escalated, the United States went into Fallujah and Ramadi, wiping out neighborhoods. So, I mean, it's puzzling when you hear US high officials say things like, well, can you cool it a little bit? You didn't cool it in Iraq. You don't have moral authority here to tell anybody to cool it. In fact, it's really interesting, Jyotisman, when you look at this. I recently, was observing that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, flew to Washington, D.C. via Argentina. Well, he flew out of Kiev airport. It's interesting that the Russians have not destroyed civilian infrastructure in Western Ukraine. They haven't destroyed the airport. Commercial planes fly in and out of that airport. When the US goes into war, they just destroy all the infrastructure. In fact, in Gaza, there is no airport because the Israelis destroyed it a long time ago. There used to be an airport. Jawaharlal Nehru flew from Gaza to Beirut in 1956 in a UN plane, which the Israelis tried to bring down. They tried to force the crashing of that plane. Nehru didn't say anything when he was in Beirut. I wrote an article about this for Frontline, but when Nehru arrived in India, he went into parliament and he said, they tried to kill me. It's a memory that is forgotten in India. But where the Israeli government, in fact, tried to kill an Indian prime minister. Something to think about. Talk about national sentiment. I mean, to have your highest elected official assassinated like that, even an attempted assassination should make people think twice about blind support for that particular project. But when the US says, well, you should cool it, well, in fact, the United States has a mechanism to make or to compel Israel to cool it, which is the US can stop funding Israel, stop sending military equipment to Israel. They can slow it down. What about that? I'm not even saying stop it. What about if they slow it down? If the United States says, look, we're not going to send you this particular this shipment of military equipment until you slow down the bombing or until you show us that the rate of murder of civilians is decreasing. But they're not doing that. So therefore, you can't take seriously words from people like Biden and other high officials saying, well, they have to eradicate Hamas and so on. As far as the New York Times is concerned, on issues that relate to Israel, it's not a newspaper. It's effectively it's the press office of the Israeli prime minister. They're not serious. I mean, they ran another piece arguing for the complexity of the concept of proportionality, making the case that, well, look, of course, there's an asymmetry in numbers. So many Israelis killed, so many Palestinians. It's utter asymmetry. There's no way to say it's justified, that level of killing. Well, they say this is not about asymmetry, it's about proportionality. Israel's military has lawyers with it, and they try not to violate human rights, and they try to use proportionate force in the battlefield environment. So when you look at the law of proportionality, Israel is not doing so badly after all. I mean, a horrendous, immoral argument. So in that sense, I don't take the New York Times seriously. It's not a serious newspaper. It's the press office of the Israeli prime minister.
On the 28th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, it republished a piece by Bret Stephens, who said, why I'm still proud of supporting the US war on Iraq, even if that killed 1 million people directly and perhaps 4.5 million people indirectly. I wanted to hear your thoughts about the US presence in the region in general. After particularly the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there were a lot of talks about US disengagement from the region. In fact, Fareed Zakaria, the high, icon of US liberalism, has recently written a piece in Foreign Affairs mentioning in fact pivot away from the Middle East. We know what is that pivot away to. It's mostly Indo-Pacific because they're escalating the war against China. Given the US still occupies areas in Syria, so many military footprint all over the Mediterranean, Africa, and the Gulf, do you see any disengagement of US from the region?
It's a very, very good question. And you put the question very well. So thank you for that. There's a different ways to understand the withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. The first way is that we need to understand that the Iraqis voted in their parliament to eject the United States. So it wasn't a voluntary withdrawal. The United States was kicked out of Iraq. The landlord said, we are going to evict you. Now, they didn't leave northern Iraq. And the reason they didn't leave northern Iraq is they've been there actually since before Saddam Hussein's removal from office. This goes back to 1991. And those military entanglement with various Kurdish political parties continues, okay? But they were kicked out of Iraq. The United States was also kicked out of Afghanistan. The Taliban had a military victory. They roared into Kabul, from having controlled most of the country. So those were not withdrawals by choice. They were removed. Farid is an embarrassment to his great father, who was one of the important nationalist scholars in India. It's an embarrassment for him to say pivot from the Middle East. Brother, there was no pivot. They were thrown out. I mean, it's different. Pivot suggests a choice. You made a choice, a strategic choice. You were ejected. Let's face the fact, okay? Which is why, for instance, in Syed Hassan Nasrallah's speech, in the early days of this conflict, a couple of 2 weeks into it, in October, Mr. Nasrallah pointed out that the United States was defeated in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And he said, don't threaten us, we will defeat you. I mean, maybe it's bragado speaking, but he was factual in that. Secondly, it's the US influence that has actually deteriorated in the region. And that has got very little to do with the region per se and more to do with geopolitics. I mean, the United States simply doesn't have the economic power or the economic ambition that, for instance, China has in that region. Saudi Arabia, for instance, has pivoted to China away from the United States, not because of some military disengagement by the US. US bases, as you rightly said, are still there in Bahrain, in Qatar, in other parts of the Gulf. It's not like the United States broke down their bases. No, they're still militarily there. But countries in the Gulf, just to take the desert Arabs as a case in point, countries in the Gulf are looking to China because China has a more ambitious economic project and more money. They are even looking to India, actually, rather than the United States. In fact, the deal that was cut, the Middle East, India, Europe corridor, which is now defunct, was not so much about the United States, but it was about the interest in India. India is a economy that's growing. It has its internal challenges, but there is economic growth. Mr. Gautam Adani owns the ports in Greece, in Haifa, and he has the ownership of the port in Gujarat, which would have been in that corridor. Adani owned at least 3 to 4 of the ports that were in that corridor. I often think it's not a Middle East, Europe, India corridor, but a Europe, Middle East, Europe, Adani corridor, because he would have been an enormous beneficiary. People don't realize he owns a port in Greece and in Haifa, not just the port in Gujarat. Anyway, these countries are pivoting away from the United States for economic reasons because of the lack of economic ability of the United States to drive an agenda there. So, in that sense, it's not that you can say, well, the US has made some decision to disengage from the region. I don't think so. What's happened is a military defeat in Iraq, important defeat, or rather an ejection by the parliament, but a defeat in Afghanistan, certainly. A strategic defeat in Syria. They were not able to bring down the government of Bashar al-Assad, even though troops remain in northern Syria. It was a major strategic defeat because they were not able to, in a sense, create that corridor of US power that they wanted, put pressure on Lebanon. If the US had been able to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, they would have gone in and basically tried to clean out Hezbollah. And that would have created a big strategic opportunity for the United States. All of that wasn't available. They were removed from Iraq. They were defeated in Afghanistan and in Syria, and they don't have the economic muscle to drive an agenda with the desert Arabs. So that's the reason they pivoted. Their sole political, power, pressure is in Israel, Morocco, couple of the smaller principalities, maybe Bahrain to some extent, and in a kind of convoluted way, Egypt. This is where the United States continues to have some, forward influence, but certainly Israel and Morocco, which is why Trump pushed the Abraham Accords with Israel, Morocco, and Bahrain. That was the axis of normalization with the Israelis. Very clear that that was the agenda to strengthen those that remain, but everybody else is lost, including Jordan in some small way, particularly during this conflict.
This was precisely what I had as my next question. I mean, you mentioned the Abraham Accord. I once wrote, I mean, when it was initially formalized, I wrote to Noam Chomsky about, the New York Times is making a great deal about this. What do you think about it? And he wrote in clear words, he said, it's a big blow to the rights of the Palestinians. So I wanted to discuss a little bit about what this conflict has done to the politics in the Middle East, because apparently there has been a great pressure on because of the mobilizations in the streets of Arabs. There seems to be great pressure on even people like King Abdullah II of Jordan or even Al Sisi in Egypt to to maintain some distance from Israel. So, and obviously, we have seen some sort of opening up of normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia under the mediating role of Chinese. How do you see the impact of this conflict, or let's say the renewed conflict, on the equations within these Middle Eastern Arab nations?
It's really a thing in flux right now. Firstly, the horrendous level, velocity, and volume of bombardment has really shocked not only the Arab populations, but people around the world. I mean, sustained demonstrations in Western countries, unending. That's marked in Britain, in the United States. These are countries that support Israel with military equipment. That's why it's important that there be these sustained demonstrations in London, in Washington, D.C., New York, and so on. So the sheer level of violence against the Palestinians has really gripped a whole generation of young people. They're not going back from this. Okay. So Israel might not feel confident that it has the backing of Western countries for very long. I think a new generation is emerging. I've been speaking on a number of these kind of shows for people in the United States, and each time there's a level of grief, of mourning in the attitude. It's not, there's not a jubilation or anything. There's a mourning. People are sad about what's happening in their name. Jewish communities like Jewish Voice for Peace and so on, putting out the slogan, not in our name, trying to disassociate themselves from Benjamin Netanyahu's government. So I don't think Israel is going to have an easy recovery after this around in the West. In the Arab world, Israel has always, among the people, had a negative attitude. People have had a negative attitude to Israel in the Arab world since 1948. That has not actually changed, inclusive of Jordan and Egypt, which made a peace agreement with Israel. Mr. King Abdullah II is under pressure. Firstly, his wife is Palestinian. She's a great outspoken champion of the Palestinian cause. So he's getting it not only from the street, but in the bedroom. I mean, he's getting that argument right through. Well, also, he should be worried because if Jordan persists in the peace agreement after all this, his kingdom is under threat. It is seriously under threat, which is why he has made strong remarks in defense of the Palestinians. They even sent air shipment of aid without asking the Israelis, as a show of force. Egypt, another one. In 1948, after the Israeli state conducted the Nakba, the catastrophe, expulsion of the Palestinians, within the Egyptian military, there was a great sense of remorse. Military officers felt like, look, what are we doing? We have this big Egyptian military and we didn't act to save our brother and sister Palestinians. It was that attitude inside the Egyptian military in 1948, 49, and 50 that resulted in the formation of the Free Officers Movement. And that's when Gamal Abdel Nasser and his colleagues overthrew the kingdom and took power in 1952. They took power basically as a response to Egypt's shameful attitude toward the Nakba. Well, Mr. Al-Sisi better beware, because there is a current inside Egypt, including in the military, saying things like, we have the best military force in the region. We've been paying the United States billions of dollars, getting aid as well, to buy the best military equipment. We've got our planes sitting at the base. I have known people in the Egyptian military for years. In this particular instance, it was very clear. Many of them said, we want to get into our planes and fly over Gaza and establish a no-fly zone. Why didn't they do it? Why didn't Sisi do it? So I don't know exactly what's going to happen in Jordan or in Egypt, two countries with a peace agreement with Israel. But people are angry. There's a lot of pressure. Now, you said the Palestinians might be pushed into the Sinai. Mr. Sisi doesn't want that. He's trying to prevent opening Rafah. He's only opening Rafah to dual citizens so that they can come out of Gaza and go to Australia, United States, South Africa, wherever, but not into Egypt. He doesn't want a permanent base of Palestinians in Egypt because he knows that if these Palestinians from Gaza come to Sinai, there's an entire new generation of fighters who are going to want to cross the border and conduct operations against the Israelis. He doesn't want that hassle. Well, he's going to face his own people. You're not allowing Palestinians in, you're not providing shelter to the Palestinians, and you're not defending the Palestinians against the Israeli military. What's the point of an Egyptian military? This is something Mr. Sisi and King Abdullah must be thinking about every night. I don't know exactly where they will come out on the other side, but they've got to be worried.
I wanted to slightly switch gear and discuss a few other points apart from Palestine. Um, we had Thomas Piketty recently on our show, and some of our discussions were revolved around inequality numbers that the World Inequality Lab report is coming up with about China, among others. Okay, all right. So basically, I asked him eventually that what are his thoughts about the Soviet Union, and it was a long response, but eventually he said that it was a catastrophe, the whole communist project. There was nothing much in it in terms of its positive. We also had Prabhat Patnaik last year, and he said that among other things, the Soviet Union's contribution towards the establishment of the idea of a welfare state, the very idea that the state is responsible for provisioning certain basic rights to people, the anti-imperialism struggle around the world, and obviously in a historical sense the defeat of Nazism. He said that the world owes so much, if not for anything else, these three reasons to the Soviet Union. You have written extensively, or you have written about Lenin and Russian Revolution and so on. What's your response to someone like Piketty, who's otherwise, who situates oneself within some camp of the left, but completely fails to see the history of Soviet Union, or for that matter, China?
Thomas Piketty is a liberal. Lots of liberal people are also worried about social inequality. In fact, even sections of the IMF and the World Bank and so on are worried about social inequality. Many years ago in the 1970s, the chair of the Bank of America made a statement. He said that, effectively, that if you don't manage inequality rates, they're coming to go and bomb your house. There's going to be violence. Um, you know,
In fact, in a famous lecture by Amartya Sen on inequality, he said that even Robert Nozick is very concerned about inequality. So it's something which cuts across political
Yeah,
strands.
I thought it was interesting when Piketty produced his book on inequality. I found it interesting that it made a big splash because, in fact, you just need to travel around the world to see the evidence of inequality. And besides, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, in its Trade and Development report every year, has pointed this out. But I mean, the publishing world is a curious world, and I mean, data on inequality is not sufficient to understand either why inequality reproduces itself or how to undo it. So I would say I caution people about seeing somebody like Thomas Piketty as an oracle about the world because, in fact, what he is somebody who I think, with great scrupulous care, has proved the obvious, which is that inequality exists in the world. Now, here's another obvious fact, and historically verifiable obvious fact. most major transformative revolutions of the 20th century took place in extremely poor and backward countries. You can start with the revolutions in Mexico, 1911, the Persian Revolution, or Majlis Revolution, 1911 in Iran. You can go to the Chinese Revolution of 1911. These three happened around the same time. Extremely poor, backward countries, backward socially in terms of social indicators, literacy rates, health, and so on. And the Tsarist Empire was one of the poorest parts of Europe. I mean, there were poor parts in Eastern Europe, but one of the poorest parts of Europe, vast agricultural terrain. The revolutions all took place in poor countries. After the Soviet Revolution, 1917, it was Mongolia, 1919. It wasn't Germany, it was Mongolia. It was the other end of the USSR, a forgotten revolution. Vietnam, 1945, extremely poor country. The Ho Chi Minh goes out to speak and say, we are trying to build a democracy here, guys. We got a tough road ahead of us. 4 years later, China, very poor country, had just come out of a war from, that started in the 1920s. Okay. But in fact, deepened in 1937 with the Marco Polo incident. From 37 to 40 is the longest Second World War on the planet. That was 49. Cuba, 1959, and so on. We can go on. Anyway, all backward, poor countries. Now, you got to judge these experiments based on where they're coming from and what they were able to do in the condition of backwardness, particularly given right after these revolutions happened, there was an attempt to suffocate them. The Soviet Union was invaded by the white armies. Somebody like Mr. Piketty making a loose statement like that, callous statement, doesn't grasp the gravity of what they're saying. He's sitting in his office in Paris, brushing away the fact that Paris might have been occupied by the Nazis, if not for the Soviet armies in the 1940s. If the Soviets hadn't come in and crushed the Nazi war machine in the Eastern Front, Mr. Piketty would have to be teaching, the collected works of Hitler in his office in France. So there's a kind of banal callousness in some of this. And I'm speaking bluntly to you because it's irritating. It's irritating to have a responsible intellectual so dismissive about complicated phenomena in world history. And I put the complexity first, Jyotisman, because people should understand that when Lenin gets into the Kremlin, he's dealing with a country which has collapsed, where people are starving and they were invaded. There were internal challenges and so on. And the advances that the Soviet Union made are better judged by a liberal like Jawaharlal Nehru than a liberal by Thomas Piketty. Nehru goes to the Soviet Union in 1927, 10-year anniversary of the revolution. And he comes back to India and he writes a book called Soviet Russia. It's not much read. And in fact, I keep thinking I want to republish the book. Because what Nehru says in that is he says, look, this reminds me of India. We go to rural Russia and it's just like rural India. The difference is, he says, in 10 years, they've got people reading. He says, you go into small villages and there's a library. People are coming and they're proud of their literacy campaign because that was the heart of the revolutionary process. Same in China, the literacy campaign. Within decades, these places eradicated literacy. When India won its independence, the literacy rate was 12%. Okay, 12%. I would like to ask Mr. Piketty, what was the literacy rate in Algeria in 1962 when the Algerians threw the French out? Now you'll tell me, well, the Algerian struggle for independence was also useless. Truly, what is the condition now in Burkina Faso, in Mali, all ex-French colonies? Let's talk about that. You see, and I'm not trying to be evasive. I'm being direct. I'm saying that to dismiss something like the Soviet Union or the Cuban Revolution or the Vietnamese Revolution without understanding that these are places where the social indicators were so deleterious to human life, and that the revolution made it its commitment to improve those conditions above all else. Of course, there were a million problems, million. in the Soviet Union, one of the classic problems which everybody talks about is violations of socialist democracy. They routinely violated their own constitution. That's an issue. And any socialist experiment that puts a legal framework into play must honor that legal framework. That's got to be the basis of your governance. Soviets struggled with that, and I'm not saying this is about this person or that person. It's convenient. Oh, Stalin did this or that. It's nonsense. The system struggled with socialist democracy. If you go and read the very great Soviet jurist Evgeny Pashukanis, you get an understanding of how complicated it is to move from a legal system based on private property rights to a new kind of legal system. And they flubbed that, and therefore the state was used sometimes aggressively against people. So yeah, there are problems. I don't evade them, but to say that the Soviet Union was something that you wish it didn't happen, in other words, although he didn't exactly say that,
Right.
I think is immature, if you don't mind me saying so.
Yeah, I guess we can take up one more question, and this is very related. And I guess some of our viewers have also asked this to you once we said that we are having Vijay, which is about how to think about socialism at this current moment, especially given someone like me and our generation who were born after the fall of the Soviet Union, and we saw a world which was much more unipolar in nature, and capitalism became much more ubiquitous. Um, Even if China is there, it has become much more of a mixed economy than what the Soviet Union was. And to think about a post-capitalist world becomes very difficult because it seems that capitalism has, even though we know that it's a social construction, but it sometimes it seems that it's the natural iron laws of the economy or whatever. What did you say to our generation who have always struggled or who struggles to think about socialism as an alternative?
Well, the first thing I would say is if you look at the amount of wealth in the world, we have a lot of capacity to generate vast amounts of social wealth. Global liquidity is something like $180 trillion. There's just a lot of money there. You don't have to look at the global aggregates. Look at India. India is not a poor country as such. There's a lot of wealth generated in India. Just in terms of the laws of capitalism, you can ask the question, why is it that in a country like India, where there's such wealth generated, there's such poor distribution of the wealth? I mean, we used to laugh at the Ambani building in Mumbai. It's a giant, quite hideous looking buildings surrounded by slums. Who wants to live in a civilization like that? Mr. Adani
By
owns
the way,
everything.
the slums of Dharavi has been given to Adani, and a lot of protests are going on. If you're following the
Yeah,
news.
exactly. I mean, it's a civilizational question. Do you there's a lot of wealth, and there's within the terrain of capitalism, not introducing socialist ideas. There's a distribution problem. That's within the discourse of capitalism. There's a major distribution problem. This distribution problem is what keeps liberalism alive. You understand? It keeps social welfare policies on the table. Social welfare policies, as Prabhat rightly said, driven home because of the example of the Soviet Union. So, within the logic of capitalism, capitalism is in a serious long-term crisis, unable to solve basic problems like hunger, poverty, despair, atomization, and so on. In fact, intensifying. Take a ride on the Delhi metro. You see, especially if you go on the Bhadarpur line, in the evening going towards Bhadarpur, if you get on that metro, it's instructive. There are tens of thousands of young people who are working, the Delhi working class, going back to their small little places where they live in Bhadarpur and beyond. On the train, they all have some kind of headphones on and are watching their phone. Do you know why? because that's their only time of leisure. In social life, leisure has been restricted to your commute to and from work. That's the crisis of civilization, to be honest, to be quite clear. Can't tolerate that forever. You need something better than that. Okay. Now, people can keep trying to work within capitalism. I don't think that's a problem. If liberalism increases, if the constituency for social democracy and social welfare increases, that's to the betterment of society. I'm not one of those people that says you got to only come down this road. Okay. At this point, with an ascendant right wing, with the political situation so poor in so many countries, if there is a growth of genuine liberalism with a mass character, you see, India, for instance, liberals basically are legalistic. They don't go out there and seek a mass project. Even within the Congress party, the liberals are mainly neoliberals. They are mainly about financial stability and so on. They're not really interested in a mass project. There's a section of the Indian social democracy that comes and goes, tries to revive itself, where there's actually a mass character. So on the one side, I would say if a constituency grows, if people say, look, I reject socialism, you can find solutions within capitalism, go ahead and try to find them. Often what happens is people can't find them, and that radicalizes them further. That's why the debate by people saying there's no solution in capitalism doesn't appeal to me. Let people go and explore that road. Let them see what's going to happen in their own history as young people. Let them find out for themselves. And if they are able to find some solutions, let them implement them. Things that improve the condition of people's lives must be put into practice. Jyotisman, this is not an ideological, we don't live an ideological world. Our principal commitment is to improve the conditions of life of people, to transcend the hideousness of the present. If there is a slow road that people want to try, by all means, go for it. Okay. Secondly, the socialist project is in serious crisis around the world only because the principal class forces to drive socialism forward have been disaggregated. That's an issue. Production processes now are not amenable to trade unionism. There's a kind of Uberization of economies. Everybody feels like I don't have a full-time job. I'm working, so many hours a day. I'm a day laborer. I mean, more and more people in India work as day workers, even in factories. They come in, they get a day or a week. They don't get, 6 months, 8 months, 2 years contract. They can be fired at any time and so on. The government keeps working with big capital to eviscerate whatever trade union protections exist. So, it is true the left has a crisis, that the principal base of the left is disarticulated. It is also vulnerable to all kinds of ideas that are out there, anti-immigrant ideas, anti-minority ideas, and so on. That battle of ideas is a real scenario. The left is in a position where we have to be honest and build from where we are, strike from where we are. That is the reason why I think sectarianism is the worst attitude at this time, which is why I started by saying if people want to keep trying on some reformist agenda, let them try. Arguing with them is not advancing the project. You build the socialist project you need. You go out there and work to build the unity of the working class, the peasantry, the precarious workforce, and so on. That must be done. Strengthen the political pole of the people. That has to be done. Let others go and do the other thing. They will come back to you. And I believe that theoretically, you know, also history has shown us that they will come back to you because they will attempt to, for instance, pass legislation, to end hunger. And in the context of India, it's not going to happen. At most, you get income transfers or you get Manrega, which is basically, giving people some work days. By the way, the Chinese did not eradicate absolute poverty through income transfers. It's very interesting. They eradicate poverty through an entire cultural transformation of the attitudes of the poor. Thousands of party members went and lived in poor neighborhoods, and they basically had to hold people's hand and show them this is how you use the digital economy. This is how you can, understand your locality. You can, rather than just create little edible food things and sit on front of your house and sell them. You can sell them online, things like that. They made people more aggressively enter the modern world. And I'm say use the word modern. I know people get angry when you say things like that, but the fact is that uh, a lot of poverty is cultural as well. People's confidence is not there. Their confidence has been destroyed by generations of people in power telling them you're nothing. So here the party members went and said, no, you are a proud proletarian. You can do a lot of things. They told children, you can study, you don't have to leave school, you can also go to college. This cultural change was a fundamental part of the eradication of absolute poverty. Why I'm saying that? It's harder to reverse. Lula's Brazil, for instance, conducted a campaign to end hunger. When the right wing came, they reversed it.
Mhm.
So you got to understand that that was not deep, that was income transfer. If you have an income transfer policy, favorite of liberals, the government comes and takes away the income transfer, it's over. Your project is ended. You got to go deeper than that. You got to build a new culture. The Indian right understands this. And I'll give you a quick example. In states like Rajasthan and so on, when the right wing gives people gas cylinders, BJP cadre go into those mohallas and they create committees of people who get gas cylinders. Those committees meet, they have political activities, they have cultural activities. In that sense, the BJP is going into the grassroots and creating an organizational structure where their power goes right to the heart of people who got a gas cylinder. In other words, there's a welfare payment, a gas cylinder, but it didn't come with salam to the boss. The welfare payment came and it was an opportunity to institutionally incorporate the people. Look, I don't have any problem with what the BJP is doing. It's not illegal what they're doing. Everybody does these welfare payments, gas cylinder, whatever, but they're clever. They've gone in and built a political project around welfare. Liberals don't do that. Liberals don't do that. They provide welfare. Congress governments in these same states provide welfare, and then they want the leader to get salamed by the people. It doesn't work like that. You got to get in there and organize. The left understands that. The left doesn't have the carrying capacity of the right now. But people need to be building the confidence of the class. Others can go and attempt a liberal solution, but they will come back eventually if they're serious people.
You mentioned about the Mumbai slums and also parts of Delhi that you referred to are have very dense, slum-like settlements. In fact, late Mike Davis's number says that somewhere around like 60 to 70% of most major Indian cities population lives under slum-like situation. I remember this email exchange with Norman Finkelstein very early, and he said that it was in the 1970s he went to India for the first time and he was in Delhi and he stayed in a Lodi hotel. And the scene that he saw from outside the hotel left him stunned because this was his first visit to the global south. Uh, I suspect this was very different from the world in Maoist China, even though in the rural there was a lot of poverty still in the 1970s. In the urban, something like the work unit system had led to massive home ownership, which is still the case, by the way. I mean, there is a lot of talk about the problem with the real estate and the housing sector, but one of the things that is not often told in the Financial Times and so on is that home ownership in China is still very high, and that's one of the reasons why as cost of living rises, people have stopped buying houses anymore. That has led to some bubbles in property sector. But in any case, we are running out of time. Always such a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.